we're back. It's The Link Online. Yes, we're here once again, and we have with me to my right is Levon Savants.
Hello, hello.
And held over for another week due to popular demand, we have Terry Haig. That's for you.
It's the crowd
wondering,
going crazy.
Yeah, fortunately that wasn't on the TV yet, but...
Right, but they can hear it. They
Yeah,
can
but
hear the crowd gathering.
okay, you have to imagine the sound
They're chanting
effects.
your name, Montgomery.
They're chanting, Haig, another week.
Mark
Anyway.
this. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, so I'm back with Mark Montgomery, and with us, of course, also back is Commander Dutil. He is back.
Thank God. It's so good to see him.
There he is, smiling face once again. And we have with us also in the control room controlling things, we have Marc-André Deschamps and Benoit Durand. So that's the team for today, and as always on the program, look at that, a shot. If you're looking at us
Oh my God, they're on television.
live on Facebook or on the RCI channel on
like a
YouTube,
Twilight
you'll
Zone,
see the darkness of the studio, but that's just because those guys are there. They're
Look at
never
that,
working in
a
the
wide
dark.
shot
Oh, we have a close-up now.
of Pierre Dutil.
All right.
Or
Yes.
is it Benoit? It's hard to tell when in that lighting.
Now back to our regularly
I've done
scheduled
shows
program.
like that. Yeah, okay. Until they tell you it's all over.
If we can get Terry's attention for just... I'd like to say hello to our listeners on Radio Paris, World Radio Paris. Bonjour to you. We have shortwave service from Germany, also carrying our program, and Kauri 97.5, Radio Nigeria, also listening to us. And today, as always, we have lots of interesting stories from and about Canada and Canadian opinions on world affairs. And speaking of world affairs, Levon, that's something you've been working on for a little while.
Yes, for the last 2 weeks, I've been working on this new podcast on Canadian foreign policy, and I'll talk about one of the people I met a couple of months ago.
All right. And Terry, you're a very sporting guy.
I'm a very sporting guy. I got a story on Larry Walker making it to the Hall of Fame, the Baseball Hall of Fame, enshrined in Cooperstown.
Why am I not surprised? Baseball and Terry.
Well, listen, it doesn't happen very often. Only 2 Canadians have ever gotten in.
Yes.
And that's-
Okay, so don't be so smart. How many Armenians are in the Baseball Hall of Fame? Huh?
I don't know. I don't
Answer me.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll Google it.
Mr. Google who knows everything. All right, so that's coming up on the program today, and we'll just move right into you, Levon. And, of course, your story.
Yes, my story. So,
Okay, and we're talking about this
Body
podcast series.
that got you all working extra hard to
Thank you very much for
fill in the big
hole that
the
was
hole
left.
left after I was re-signed to work on this podcast. And well, the podcast, as many of our listeners know, Radio Canada International offers a lot of podcasts, including this show that is available to download on Apple, Google, Android, or anywhere else you find your podcasts. So, but I've been working on a new series. It's called Diplomatic Dispatch, and as the name suggests, it's about Canadian foreign policy, Canada's role in the world. My goal is to offer listeners insights into Canadian foreign policy, into Canadian defense, international development through interviews with various experts, former diplomats, soldiers, academics, humanitarian workers, activists. So at the end of November, I went to Ottawa for 2 days where I participated at the Summit on Canada's Global Leadership. And there I met Stephen Cornish. He is the CEO of the David Suzuki Foundation. That's one of the largest Canadian or most prominent Canadian environmental groups. But the interesting thing about Stephen Cornish is that he comes from a very strong humanitarian background. He was the former head of Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. And he says that, he's been in war zones, in disaster zones, and he says that's where he realized that a lot of these conflicts, the famines, the mass movements of migrants, were actually caused by climate change. And if we were to address the underlying causes of these humanitarian catastrophes, we need to address climate change. So he was one of the keynote speakers at this summit, and his idea was that Canada really needed to look at its foreign policy, at its international development policy, with a more what he called the green lens. And so I asked him what he meant by greening Canada's foreign policy, and this is what he had to say.
Well, I think we've taken big steps here at home. Our government, as you know, signed up to the Paris Accords to try to keep the world's temperature from rising past 1.5 degrees. And in that, we started big steps at home. We have a pan-Canadian framework that's rolling out carbon tax and clean fuel standards and building standards and transportation and really trying to get us moving towards a lower carbon world. But before Paris, we signed up to the Kyoto Accords. And the Kyoto Accords said that those who caused climate change have to help those who are suffering most. And we know that OECD countries, including Canada, have caused the lion's share of all the carbon in the atmosphere. And so we signed up then to extend technical support, adaptation support, and mitigation support to countries around the world. And somehow we've sort of forgotten to lift up to that end of the bargain.
What does it mean in practical terms? What do you want Canada to do? And other OECD countries as well?
Yeah, in practical terms, it would mean helping different countries to adapt and to mitigate their own carbon. So some of the ideas that we put forward, one was just on financing. On financing, we continue to finance heavy CO2 industries and fossil fuel industries through development banks and through our own banks. So the first thing to do would be to stop doing that, so we turn the taps off, and then use those financing mechanisms to extend green bonds to help countries be able to afford the transition to renewable energy, and insurance, risk insurance, so that after storms, climatic events, those countries would be able to recover themselves. We also need to help them to lower their CO2 and to become more resilient. And to do that, there's a number of things that you need to do around cities. You need to make them decentralized from big grids, put them on renewable energy. You need to have agriculture adapt to the changes. And in some areas, you need to prevent flooding and have them stronger in the face of storms. And you can use natural assets to do that. So those are some of the types of things we can do in order to really begin making a difference overseas as well as at home.
So a lot of the talk at the summit was centered around the need for Canada to completely rethink its foreign and international development policy. So I asked Stephen, what would that mean in terms of, Canada's putting this environmental issues into Canada's foreign policy and international development?
So right now we do it in an incremental fashion. Where we will link climate change to some other issues in our foreign trade, in our foreign assistance. But what happened is last year we had the report by the International Panel on Climate Change, which told us that we have 10 years now to reduce the global temperature rise and keep it at 1.5 degrees. And if we don't, we're heading to 2 degrees or above. And the difference between that half degree doesn't sound like much, but that's the difference between tens of millions of people being displaced, millions and millions suffering severe drought, many, many people suffering food insecurity. And so we have to start taking this like the emergency that it is. And that means we have to put all hands on deck, and this needs to become a signature issue, not a side issue that we deal with on the side. And we've had a tendency in this country to change our foreign policy every time we change governments and every time we get a new term and we bring on a new issue. And they're all very important issues. We've signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are all important. They range from education to health to jobs, so many things. But all of the progress that we've made on all of those areas is going to be wiped out by climate change. We see that just with one tornado going through the Caribbean, where 10 years of disaster assistance is gone in the matter of hours. And so we really need to marshal, and the way we went into whole of government approach to some of the conflicts we've fought, we need to put towards climate change.
And that was Stephen Cornish. He's the CEO of the David Suzuki Foundation, and an interesting idea there that was, I think, raised in the past federal election campaign by a Green Party leader, Elizabeth May, who talked about this need to create a climate war cabinet and, come up with these policies and really think about addressing climate change as, in the way Canadians addressed fighting World War II or World War I. It was like a whole of a government and whole of a national approach to it.
You know, it's interesting when you said that Mr. Cornish tied all these conflicts and mass migrations and things more or less into climate change. And I couldn't help but remember an interview I did, a couple of interviews I've done with Gwyn Dyer, who is a geopolitical expert. And he wrote, it must be like 10, 12 years ago now, easily, a book called Climate Wars. And that's exactly the scenario that he suggested, is that when you have people who can no longer exist within the climate as it changes, they're going to get into conflict with other people around them, and then internationally and so on and so forth. It's very, what would you say, futuristic looking book, to a warning of what is happening already. And this was done, as I said, 10 years ago. Gwyn Dyer, Climate Wars.
Yeah, it's interesting. He was, we talked about, for example, the mass migration, and, we're talking about, Trump's policies and stuff like that. And he said, what he doesn't realize is that when we talk about migrants, very often we say, oh, they're fleeing violence. But he says, if you look more closely, is there a lot of this Latin American or Central American farmers who are moving massively into the U.S. through, from Guatemala through Mexico and stuff like that. The origin of the crisis that because of climate change, these people were forced out of their farms.
Because the crops weren't growing, so they had no food.
Yeah, so they went to the cities. In the cities, they encounter gangs, all kinds of conflicts, and now they're political corruption, and now that's driving them to in this mass migration towards the United States, creating instability, conflict, all kinds of movements against them. And and the scale in Africa is even bigger. You have, all these countries in the Sahel, basically with exploding population, and at the same time, climate change, famine, feeding wars, political instability. And it's a vicious circle. And he says, unless we address climate change, we're not going to address these wars.
Mm-hmm. All right. So once again, if you have any thoughts on that, drop us a line at RCI, and we'd be glad to hear your comments on any of our stories. Of course, if you go to the bottom of any of our stories, there is a space there where the public can comment, and it'll take a little bit of a while for your comments to be approved, like 24 hours or something like that. But nonetheless, you can have your thoughts expressed on our website if you go, once again, to the bottom of any story. And they're not timed out by it. You can go to, if you come across a story like 2 years ago, you can still make a comment to it. So that's something that you can participate in as well. Coming up, we're going to take a look at about a story about millionaires who say, you have to tax us more.
Oh, really?
Well, there's a small group of the world's uber rich. They've sent a letter to the World Economic Forum saying millionaires and billionaires should be taxed even more. 2,000 billionaires in the world have more money than 60% of the world's population. So that's something like 2,000 people have more money than the rest of billions of people around the world. Now, I spoke to Jeff Rubin. He is the former chief economist at CIBC Markets and the author of the forthcoming book called The Expendables: How the Middle Class Got Screwed by Globalization. Now, he notes that most tax systems are based on salary income, your wages, but most of the rich get their money from investments, and much more than salaries, and those investments are taxed at a much lower rate than wages. So even though you may have an indexed salary system, the people at the top are still getting taxed much less than what they actually earn because most of their income comes from these investments. And so in Canada, for example, we're short annually about $3 billion because of about $240 billion that Canadian rich people have invested offshore, or for corporations, of course. And that's the other thing, is these giant mega corporations, they work things around such that their income is taxed in offshore markets or somewhere at a much, much lower rate. So they too are escaping billions of dollars in taxes. Now, anyway, this small group of these uber rich is not saying they need to pay more taxes for altruistic reasons. They're afraid And what they're afraid of is their message actually is more taxes or pitchforks. And what they're afraid of is that historically, when there has been a great disparity between the classes, the uber rich and everybody else, that's led to social and political upheaval. And here's what Jeff Rubin had to say.
When the super rich don't pay their taxes, it creates, a fiscal gap. And guess who pays to close that fiscal gap? You do.
Now, we've heard stories in the past. Every January 1st, there's an article somewhere that says the world's CEOs have earned more by lunchtime than the average worker will in an entire year. How did we get to this state of inequality?
And not only the CEOs, the fact that companies like Apple and Facebook and Google are notorious for booking global revenues in low tax or no tax jurisdictions and get away with paying very little tax on the billions of revenue that they generate. How did we get there? Well, that's a big question. That's part of globalization. But for most people in our society, globalization has been a race to the bottom.
Well, if these millionaires and billionaires are concerned about, paying more taxes and so on, why don't they just sort of donate a large portion of their money to?
Well, I think these people who are writing this letter represent a very small subset of the income group that they represent. But I think what the people who have written this letter are worried about, and the reference to pitchfork, is that they're losing popular support and that the middle class is now open to hearing other voices that would be very injurious to billionaires around the world. A survey just came out and also sort of targeted to this Davos conference, showing that in 28 liberal democracies, the majority of people no longer believe that global capitalism is working for them. And that, ultimately will take a political expression.
Well, Mr. Rubin, you are the author of The Expendables, How the Middle Class Got Screwed by Globalization. Does this fit into that somehow? And what did you mean?
It fits exactly into that because it talks about basically how governments seem to be powerless to do anything in a global sort of economic order, which for most households, not the wealthiest, but for most households, has been a race to the bottom. And the middle class has been the bedrock of support for liberal democracy. But that can no longer be taken for granted because the middle class has been impoverished, the middle class has been left behind, and it's now open to hearing other voices and perhaps looking at other political models. And anytime we've seen such a maldistribution of income and concentration of wealth, those circumstances have proved to be unsustainable because they've always provoked social and political change. And I suspect today won't be any different.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with Jeff Rubin. He's an author and a former chief economist at CIBC Markets. And as he mentioned there, he said, this is possibly what explains the rise in populism, is that people just don't believe the standard message and the politicians that have been saying it for the last, since the Second World War, I guess. And he says, now you've got this survey that says a lot of people no longer think the system is working for them. And so they're open to other ideas and say, what do we got to lose? Because this isn't working for us, so let's try something else, I guess.
The ghost of communism again, rising up. It's not just over Europe anymore. It's interesting that you have all these populist movements, and there's a lot of anti-establishment sentiment. Mm-hmm. But in the U.S., they elect another billionaire. It's
yeah, but what is the message of that billionaire? He's saying, things aren't working. Let's make it great again. So it's, yeah. I mean, he's a billionaire, but he's giving them the message that.
Well, we'll see if his supporters can figure it out. That he's really not on their side. except for the high Republicans that are backing him, and the people out in the mines, the people out in the Midwest. Maybe they'll figure it out. Although, America, we're not doing any socialism here, boy. Look what the farmers got in Iowa, right? What did they get? $28 billion because of the trade war with China. I mean, the whole thing is ludicrous. The whole thing is completely out of control. And it started out, speaking of the states, as far as I can figure out, it was really manifested badly when Reagan took over. Because all of a sudden, customers didn't count anymore at a bank. Everything is made for the investors of a particular company. And so your wages go down because we got to pay our investors more money. That's it. It's completely wacko. I'm sorry, it is.
Well, that's what he said. It's a race to the bottom, because no longer people don't count. It's you got to squeeze every last.
People got to step up and talk it up, man, and say something.
Well,
hey?
This is what
seriously.
This is what he's saying.
You just get pushed around. Power to the people, I say.
No, pass it
up
on.
The rebels.
No, pass it on. What's the other one?
No, you're not going to get me singing International here.
And he's not going to debate me either. Because he's way too
between
smart.
two of you, I've actually lived in the Soviet Union, so I've actually known the other system, and it's not better.
No, there's always elites everywhere that are running the show, and they don't seem to have very good fastballs, it seems to me. Oh, we're almost running out of time. Speaking of fastballs.
Speaking of fastballs.
How's that for a segue?
Let's skip the little bit of music and go straight to Mr. Haig.
Okay, Dutil will sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game, I think. Okay, so, all right, this week, big news in Canada, okay? There's a guy named Larry Walker, grew up in Maple Ridge, British Columbia, okay? He's the luckiest guy on the face of the earth. He's wanted to be a hockey player. He wasn't quite good enough. He was a goalie. He tried out for Regina, couldn't make Regina, went back to British Columbia, learned to play baseball, and he was a phenomenal baseball player. Phenomenal. So good.
How good was he?
How good was he? He's good enough to make the Hall of Fame this week, along with Derek Jeter. He came and played for the Expos for a while, which is where I met him. Then he got traded after. That's another story. He got free agent. He went to Colorado. Was a big star in Colorado, and only one other Canadian has ever made Cooperstown, been enshrined in Cooperstown. That's Ferguson Jenkins, Chatham, Ontario. So two Canadians. Walker got in this week. So. He played for the Expos, and I decided to talk to Rich Griffin, who's a mutual friend of both Walker's and mine. He was the director of PR for the Expos at that point. Now he's the director of baseball PR for the Toronto Blue Jays. And we started talking, we're going to talk about Walker, and we started talking about somehow something completely different right at the start. So listen up. As I was preparing to call you today, I mean, where do you start with Larry Walker, in my introduction, I said, Hall of Fame ball player for sure, but a Hall of Fame guy, yes, always has been. And I was thinking also, another Hall of Fame guy who has a connection to the Expos is another mutual friend of ours, Donald Sutherland, who 2 years ago finally got an Academy Award. So that's Walker and Sutherland back-to-back almost, finally getting the hardware that they deserve. Both of them are so Canadian, it probably rankled them inside. They never felt the need to express frustration at not being recognized, and yet now they both are. Rich, how you feeling as a Canadian?
Well, I think that the Donald Sutherland comparison is great because Donald was in so many quality films and had so many quality roles and not recognized. And as you were pointing out about Larry Walker, I mean, there's not one teammate that I knew, and I knew him the first 8 years, or worked with him every day the first 7 or 8 years of his career. And there's not one teammate, whether it be Latin, African-American, white, that did not get along with him as a best friend. And with the talent that he brought to the table consistently over the years in the 5 tools, some are saying 6 tools, because of his innate sense of baseball, of how to play the game the right way. It's a good comparison, and it's great to see both guys get their just reward.
And, to quote Lou Gehrig, Walker has to be the luckiest guy on the face of the earth, because if he had made the Regina Pats all those years ago, when he was the third-string goalie, if he'd been slightly better as a goalie, Griffin, he would have spent his life in the East Coast Professional Hockey League, I think, making $40,000 a year. Instead, he went back And his grandfather and his father both played baseball, so it was in his genes, but it was just, there was nothing clouding his instinct to play the game. Nothing got in the way of that.
And there was one, I remember in the early 90s, I think it was 93, we were in a clubhouse in Philadelphia, and they had this, Ron McLean, the trainer, had this newfangled board with lights that flashed, and you had to touch the flashing light as it went around the board. And Larry Walker hit every light. It was unbelievable how quickly he did it. And like there was not another player in that clubhouse who could even approach that, which makes me wonder why he couldn't be a goaltender.
I know.
But yes, the baseball and Canadian baseball are thankful that he didn't, because in the long run, every young Canadian that when I was writing for the Star that I spoke to, junior national team or pro coming up or in the major league, said that Larry Walker was their inspiration because of the timing of his ascension into Major League Baseball stardom.
That was part of my conversation, the start of my conversation with Rich Griffin. He is now the director of public relations for the Toronto Blue Jays, but he was also that's had a similar job with the Montreal Expos for many years, and in fact was a fabulous baseball writer for the Toronto Star for 25 years.
What happened to that campaign? There was a talk about a couple of months ago that the Expos might be coming back, and it's disappeared completely. You know,
it's not happening. There aren't enough people.
You think?
Listen, you have a city that is full of immigrants who couldn't care less about baseball. It's not our game.
Soccer, football.
Well, we'll give you a chance. I mean, look at what happened. Walker, it wasn't his game either. No, you're right. No, you're right. And the other thing is you need the money for the skyboxes. For the luxury boxes. I don't know if there's that kind of wealth in this town.
Corporate.
Thank you very much. Corporate support. And the fact of the matter is they're talking about Tampa Bay coming here. I just read Tampa Bay has signed an enormous broadcasting contract down there, so they ain't going anywhere because it doesn't matter anymore really how many people are in the stands. It's the television audience, the television ratings that drive the salaries, that drive the revenue.
And I don't know whether the Blue Jays, it was a much bigger market, are doing. How are they doing?
They did fine for a couple of years, in 2015, 2016, when they were contending and made it to the playoffs. But they tore the team down. Now they're slowly building it back up and trying to get people to come out there. But I think there's a tradition of baseball in Canada. But the thing is, how long is the season? That's the problem. Yeah, I mean, it's what at most 6 months.
At most,
when you can get out and throw a baseball around. The rest of the time, you got to put skates on.
And it's very if you
want snowball.
Snowballs don't go anywhere. You give them strike them with the bat, they just sort of explode. I mean, how do you figure that out?
Now, but having said that, in 1994, when they had the work stoppage and the strike, the Expos had the best team in baseball. They were going to win the pennant. If there hadn't been the work stoppage, they would have won the World Series. They would have drawn fans for the next 5 years. The players were the stars were let go. They were let go. They were fired. They were traded. All of them were prepared to come back, including Walker, and work for less than market value to keep that team together. But management couldn't find it in their hearts, or couldn't. I don't know whether agents got involved. Management would not meet them halfway. Okay, or it would still be happening. The other thing is they were playing at Olympic Stadium, and Mordecai Richler once said, one of his smartest, he said, the last place a Canadian wants to be in the summer is indoors. Okay?
Yeah,
so if you wanted to watch baseball in Montreal, you had to go down and sit in this horrible stadium.
Sometimes
indoors.
some pieces of which fall off occasionally.
Well, that too.
And the roof never worked as well.
What a shame.
I was trying to think, before we go, there was a great baseball song that I used to play when I was a DJ, and I can't think of the name of it. There's like tons of baseball songs.
Put Me in Coach. Was it John Fogerty?
No.
Talking baseball.
That might be it. Who did that one?
I forget what the guy's name. He was a friend of Jim Croce's. He was a protege of Jim Croce's.
Yeah.
Because he's got a name.
I used to like to play that song.
Okay.
Anyway,
The walking encyclopedia
Of trivia. I know, it's my
baseball
mind. It's really
trivia.
it's kind of
and
a
now,
shame.
ladies and gentlemen,
It really
for
is a
Terry
shame.
Haig, for Levon Savants, myself, Mark Montgomery, for
And Larry
Benoit-
Walker and Donald Sutherland.
Benoit Durand,
and Tamara Savant, who's
Commander
going to be
Dutil,
an acting
and
star in
Marc-André.
New York as well.
That's all the time we have for the show.
right.
And I'm sure some of you are going, thank goodness for that.